Hey fly fishers, Lance Egan here. Guess what? A fresh skill builder for you. Today I'm going to walk you through what I like to do with streamers line wise on a larger river. Check it out.
That's a big brown.
Alright friends, so we're on the river today, bigger water than we usually do our skill builders on. There are a few fish rising, so I hope you see some of those in the background. We've been fishing dries, the hatch is mostly over now, so we're going to try this afternoon to get some fish on streamers. And with that in mind, I want today to share with you just my thoughts on streamer fly lines. So you can use floating lines, sinking tips, full sinks, a bunch of different types of lines for streamers. But there are different reasons to use different lines for different applications, and in my opinion they go as such. When you want to stay shallow, you want to move stuff slow, a floating line, small river. You could even use a floating line in a big river like this with weighted streamers, a longer leader. The floating line allows you to do a lot of mending. It allows you to keep flies up off the bottom so you can pull streamers through shallow riffles. If you're a wading angler, maybe a floating line and a sink tip that's relatively short, or maybe one that's a bit longer, can also be key. So for instance, right now I'm rigged with a Scientific Angler's Titan sink tip. So this is a shorter sink tip line. This particular one, floating running line, and about in the 6 weight, which is what I'm fishing today. I think this is a 10 or 12 foot sink tip, so relatively short on the tip. If I was fishing from a boat, or if we were in deeper sections of this river, I would probably opt for a 25 or 30 foot sink tip. And I may even break one of those out later in some deeper water. We'll see how this goes. But what I really want to focus on here are a couple of thoughts. One, think of your line in terms of its density and how it can enable your flies to get down or keep them shallower. If I throw a 250 grain sink tip in a shallow riffle, I'm going to be on the bottom in seconds. When the water's cold and I need to move flies slower, a slower sinking tip or a floating line might help keep your flies up off the bottom. On the flip side, if you're pounding steep undercuts and banks, a really dense, fast sinking line, this may be a longer sink tip, will help you get your flies down and help keep them pulling more horizontal or even pulling down. The fastest way to get flies down is to have really heavy flies, but streamers that are really heavy swim more in an up and down motion, and sometimes you want more of a side to side or really erratic motion. So sometimes it's necessary to have a faster sinking line depending on the desired effect you want of your flies. All right, with that in mind, I'm going to sneak out here with this sink tip. I've got a 2 streamer rig on here. I have basically a poacher and kind of a sparkle minnow as my top fly. So I've got a double streamer rig again on a sink tip. I'm going to step out here and see if I can find a fish. All right, real quick before I get in here, one last thought I want to share with you, which is why I'm choosing as a wading angler to fish a sinking tip line and not a full sink line. If I use a full sink line, it will help get my flies to depth, but it won't float when I go to retrieve. So when I move the line in and strip it like this, a sinking line, a full sink line, would sink at my feet. The same is true with a very, very long sinking head. If I have a 25 or 30 foot head and I'm making lots of short casts, 25, 30, 40 foot casts, which are very common with streamers, I strip in so much line that the sinking portion of the line then ends up on the water. And when your line doesn't float on the surface, the running line that is, doesn't float on the surface, when that happens you can't pick it back up and retrieve and make the cast, make the flies and the rest of your line pick up and go back out through to shoot a forward cast. So when that happens, if I make a cast like this and my line isn't floating or at least staying relatively high in the column, if a sinking line gets down, one, it gets into the weeds, gets into the sticks, gets into the rocks, and when I go to make another cast, it won't pick up off of the water like that one just did and allow me to make the next presentation. What it will do instead is it'll have enough surface tension and enough tension on the water of the line that's sunk that it will make my cast turn over prematurely instead of shooting and carrying. So I'm using a sinking tip or a floating line as a wading angler exclusively. If you're in a boat, then you can get away with a full sink line at times because you're stripping into the boat, right? The other thing to consider, if you're fishing in a boat, I still usually like a sinking tip because I can then, whether I'm on the bank or from the boat, I can make casts and then the back end of the line, because it floats, I can pick it up and mend it and reposition the line to change how fast my flies traverse across currents. So I can throw downstream, in this case, mends to speed up the swing. I can throw up and across mends to slow down the swing, and that affects the speed at which my flies travel through the river. So now that you understand why I'm fishing a sink tip, let's see if we can find some fish out here. All right, with all of these fly lines, whether you're fishing a floating line, a 30-foot head, a 10-foot head, a 5-foot head, doesn't matter. With all of them, you can employ different techniques as far as stripping. So you can also just swing flies. You can fish them fast. You can fish them slow. You can pause them. The worst thing I think you can do when you're streamer fishing is just do the same strip, 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 strip all the time. You want to mix it up some. Whether that means doing lots of quick strips and then a pause, or really fast and then stopping, or really, really, really fast. All of those can be effective at times, in addition to doing what I call the seesaw, where you're just letting the current kind of pull your line and you're pulling and giving like that. Oh, they do like the seesaw. I don't know why they like that one so much, but they like that. Either way, whatever you're doing, you need to mix it up. Some days the fish really like the flies moving fast. Some days they like them moving slow. That can change based on conditions, can change based on the fly pattern you're using. That can change based on the water temperature. So you got to play with that every day. But you definitely don't want to just keep pulling the flies the exact same speed all the time. There's one, fun little brownie, beautiful fins. That one took a little bugger on the seesaw. And the key there was changing techniques, changing retrieves. I'd already thrown several casts where I'd gone pretty quick and short. I'd gone somewhere I'd ripped it. As soon as I went to the seesaw, fish on. So maybe that pattern will reproduce itself, maybe not, maybe that was a fluke, but the point here is change your retrieves, change your strips, change your cadence, try long strips, try short, quick, all kinds of things. Whatever you do, just don't keep doing the same boring strip all day long every day. All right, just to demonstrate the mending I was talking about a couple of minutes ago, when you send a cast out, the floating running line of a sink tip, I can cast and mend upstream like that to slow my flies down, make them come across the current slower. Or if I wanted to speed them up, let's say the water was warmer or the fish are willing to chase, I can send it out, throw a mend downstream, and it will actually accelerate the flies. And in different scenarios, both of those could be super effective. So again, think of ways you can manipulate the line. Again, I'm using this sink tip, which allows me to do mending. I can throw a big mend upstream. Then I can get tight to my flies. I can try the old seesaw again. You can strip them in. You can do short, quick. You can do big, long poles, all kinds of different things to mix it up. And then you can also use the back end of the sink tip to mend, allow the flies to get to depth, all kinds of things. In this particular spot, it's not very deep, so I don't need to really let the sink tip get down much. Oh, there was a bite. I do need to get the flies down in the zone a little bit, but I don't need to get them crazy deep because then I'm just going to snag the bottom all the time. But I can, in some situations, let's say it dropped off here. If it dropped off a lot, one of the things I might do is throw a cast out like this. Then I would throw a big mend upstream. Then I would feed it some slack and then give it some drift, some space to get downstream. And all while that fly line and flies, I have weighted flies on here too. While the sinking line and weighted flies have slack, they're sinking all the time. So if we move upstream or down and we find a spot where it's significantly deeper, it might be really important in that case to throw upstream a bit more, allow time for the sinking tip to do its magic and get down deep. If not, if we end up just fishing shallow, then I can just do some casting and stripping where I don't have to do much mending with the rod tip. All right, friends, I moved upstream just a little bit. There is a bit of a bucket right here, not super deep, but it does have a little bit of depth. So in this case, I may send my streamers out right to the edge of that shelf, I can throw a little mend in there because of my fly line tip is in slower water than where my flies are. And I can allow that sink tip to get down, let my flies sink right off that shelf, and then I can pull them through that deeper water and probe the depths using the sink tip to my advantage. If I really wanted them to get deep, and I don't need it here, but in some cases you might throw well upstream of it, like I was saying earlier, throw some mends at it, allow the flies and the line to really plummet, get down to depth. In this case, it's not quite that deep, it's just a little deeper than where I was at the tail out. So you can throw flies out to the drop off and then swing them down through that little trough. All right, we've moved upstream again. We've waded out to a rocky point, and about 2 rod lengths away, there's a bit of a drop off. Again, doesn't get real deep, but it gets deeper, deep enough that I'm gonna be able to use my sink tip to my advantage and get flies down in that little trough, help keep them there just a little bit longer. I'm gonna start real short first, then I'm gonna start moving casts a little bit farther away if I don't make a big mess of my fly line. That one should be deep. Let's get it back to where we can fish it. Okay. There we go. So that sink tip is working now to help keep my rig down just a little bit. The floating line's nice because it's pulling up towards me as I get to the shallows. It's awfully windy today, so we're having to change our casting technique based on that. All right, I fished short. Now I'm going to take a few steps out and get a little bit closer to the drop off. All right, we've waded out to the edge here. Now I'm on the edge of the drop off, just a rod length out. This is actually pretty good current for lots of things, but it looks really good to me to do a little seesawing. So I'm going to send this rig out here relatively short, and I'm just going to do some of the old seesaw trick because there's plenty of current to keep it under tension. If I start snagging bottom, start feeling it touch bottom, then I'm going to have to shorten it or lighten up my flies. And then once it gets straight down below me, I have to bring in retrieve the flies, bring them back closer to me. But here in close, I can just use the current to kind of move my rig along, pull and give, pull and give. This is especially deadly in colder flows when the fish are not willing to chase, because instead of stripping the fly away from the fish really quickly, that seesaw makes the fly kind of move and then fall back into the fish's face. Move, fall into their face, move, fall into their face. It's still coming across the current, but it's doing it at a much slower pace than if I were to just simply strip. There again, with this sinking tip, I could mend across to slow down the swing, or I could mend down to my left to speed up the swing going across current there. Let's try a couple more here, see if anybody wants to play along. There's a nice rock structure out there, maybe pause some right in front of it. Nobody home. That's all right, good fun. We tried it. Now we can mix it up and try doing some other stripping. I can send it a little further across as well. Now I'm into a little bit of a gut. I'm going to seesaw again. Try some shorter, quicker bumps. All the while just changing it up as we go. All right, one other tip for you with sink tips. The running line of most of them is relatively bright colored, green in this case. They're often chartreuse or orange or tan. And in this particular water type where I am here, it's not real helpful, but especially in slower water types and places where you're making slower presentations, one advantage you can do is also watch the floating portion of the line to help you detect strikes. Because a lot of times it will change direction where it transitions from the floating bright color line to the sinking dense part of the line. You can watch that all of a sudden as it's swinging across the current, just dart and stop, get tight, change direction, do anything that tells you you might have a fish on there. So watching that as it traverses the current can sometimes help. All of a sudden it tightens up. If you're really paying attention, you'll often see that happen. You'll see your line move before you ever feel a tactile strike. Now in lots of streamer situations, I like watching the streamers. I often fish 2 streamers together, but even if you're fishing one, especially from an elevated platform like a boat, I'm constantly throwing the cast out and watching the streamers to know where they are, if I need to speed them up, if I need to slow them down and get them deeper. But when that's not possible, whether you have gray light, you have low light conditions, or you're just fishing again really slow, watching that floating portion of the sink tip can help you register a strike. All right, let's talk about tips for casting sink tips. They are a little bit awkward. They have a dense tip connected to a much less dense running line. So you don't really want to throw a nice tight loop. You can throw a pretty wide open loop with them. And you don't want to try and carry too much line. They're designed mostly to be shot. So ideally you get them to where they're relatively short, 1 or 2 false casts, and just kind of let them go. The dense line wants to shoot really well. Try not to false cast it more than you need to. It doesn't do you a lot of good anyway. Look at these fish, they're still sipping some blue wings in here. It's maddening to be trying to throw a streamer rig while they're rising, but we got to do it. We threw dries earlier. Now it's time to walk through the casting. So I like to throw kind of a backhand or a back cast that is under the rod tip. So Belgian style, under, then over the fly or over the rod tip with the flies going forward. That throws a nice wide open loop. It allows me to shoot line very easily. The next tip is using the wind to your advantage. So in this case, I've got wind. Currently it's pretty low, but it's been gusting down the canyon today. So casting the direction that I am is great because it allows the flies to be pulled away from my body. If I were going to cast this direction, I may want to do a back cast rather than a forward cast. A back cast, backhanded cast, I mean, because if I cast this way out here to this river right side of the stream here, and I get a big gust, it can blow the flies into me. So rather than have that happen, what I can do is throw backhand like this across the river, and that way the wind will still blow my flies and the line and everything away from my body rather than into my body. A couple of other tips, some things you've seen me doing already, collecting the line so it'll shoot a lot better if it's here close to you. So if you can pull it up close to you, the current's going to always bring it away, but it will shoot best if it's collected like that rather than if it's way downstream of you. So that's one tip. Another casting tip would be kind of starting with a roll. There's those gusts I was talking about. So you can roll your flies off the water, then send them out. Again, minimizing back casts. We don't need a lot of back casts. We don't want to do a lot of casting motion. It's an awkward line to cast. They're dense. They shoot really well, but you can do a little bit of water load. You can roll into a cast. If you do that though, you can't let the flies and the sink tip land and stick on the water for very long. So it's not a typical roll cast where if I try and roll cast this like this, it won't go very far because the sinking portion of my line is a sink 6 and it doesn't want to lift off the water well. But what I can do is do kind of a fishing roll where I roll the flies out under water tension, or let's say I've stripped them all the way in and I want to just kind of pick the flies up, throw them out for a water load, but as soon as they hit, pick it back up for a back cast and send them. If you leave that forward cast, that water load in the water too long, like you would for a floating line, it won't work. The sinking flies and or sinking tip of the line are going to create too much stick. So just be quick with it. If you send a water load out, the second it hits, you got to lift it back off and then send it. You can throw a pretty long cast with a nice quality shooting head, nice quality sink tip, really quick, really easy. Otherwise, when you're managing line, like I said, if the line gets way downstream of you, there's not a ton of current where I'm standing. If it was much faster, all of this line that I've stripped in would be way downstream of me. So there are times with a sink tip where before I cast, I actually pull all the line and I sometimes shoot it upstream of me like that. That way it's floating back to me during my casts and I can more easily shoot it. with the tension of the water pulling it downstream of my position, it doesn't always shoot quite as well. So consider managing that line before you go to make your next presentation. Otherwise, it's going to take a little getting used to. They are very different. They're very dense. Better to throw that open loop. But practice with it. If you need to, go to the park. Better yet, get a streamer, get a friend to row you down the river and get a little time on the water throwing a sink tip. All right, I've talked a lot about sink tips in this video. Ideally, if you're going to do a lot of streamer fishing, a lot of sink tip fishing, you're going to end up with several sink tips, so it's a good idea to have reels that have spools available. That said, not everybody's going to get a whole bunch of them, so let me maybe narrow it down for you on how to choose a sink tip, since most people are going to end up with a single sink tip to try and cover as many bases as possible. So like I mentioned, I've got a shorter sink tip here. That's what I've been fishing today. The water's pretty low. When the water's higher here, when we have more flows, I throw this longer 150 grain 25-foot head, or this 200 grain. Sorry, I have those backwards. This is the 200 grain, this is the 150 grain, but either way, both are 25-foot sink heads. So a little bit longer to keep flies down, pulling deeper. They make sink tips that are longer still, 30-footers. They make sink tips that are 5-footers and 10-footers and all kinds of stuff. So based on where you think you're going to do most of your fishing, smaller rivers, shallower waters, shorter sink tip, bigger water, more sinking rate, more sinking line to pull a little bit deeper, longer sink heads. From a boat, I tend to fish these longer 25-footers more often. When I'm wade fishing, I tend to fish more of the 10, 15 maybe foot sink tips. So keep that in mind when you're trying to buy a sink tip. All right, real quick, a couple more things to think about when you're buying sink tips. First, they come in grain weights a lot of times instead of line weights. You can find some that have both. Don't let that intimidate you. You can do a tiny bit of research or ask the fly shop, stop in to Fly Fish Food, send us a message online, go to your favorite fly shop, whatever you're doing to get your line, and do a little research, and it'll tell you, whether 150 grain sink tip, what weight rods they go on, and a 200 and so on. I can give you some real basic ideas there, like a 150 would work on a 4 through about a 6 weight. It's a little underweighted for a 6, but it will work best on a 5. A 200 works on a 6, works on a 7, still actually castable on a 5. A 250 works well on a 6, great on a 7, will work on an 8. A 300, still workable on a 7, but pretty heavy, works great on an 8, works on a 9. Keep in mind, the heavier the grain weight is, the easier, the more mass that it will carry a fly with it. So same is true when you're talking fly line weights. So a 6 carries more weight, carries a bigger streamer with greater ease than a 5. And a 7 goes from 160 grain line to 185 grain line. So the 7 weight with more mass will carry a heavier fly, and an 8 at 210, heavier fly still. So keep that in mind. The fly size you're going to throw can help dictate how heavy a grain weight of a line you need, or how heavy the fly line weight you need. Next up is sinking rates of the fly line. So I've talked a lot about sinking tips. They don't just make one sink tip. So you can get an intermediate tip that sinks at like 1.5 inches, 2 inches per second, a type 2, a type 3, a type 4, a type 5, a type 6, a type 7, and on and on. In real simple terms, a type 4 sinks at 4 inches per second, a type 6, 6 inches per second, and so on. So the faster you need it to get down, the faster you want that sink rate of your sink tip. For most streamer fishing for trout, I find most of my situations, especially that I encounter in the Rocky Mountain West, I'm rarely getting down too fast, so most of the time I err on the side of getting a type 5, type 6, type 7 type sink tip rather than really slow stuff. But in places like Alaska, or situations where you might have consistent depth that's not very fast, you might like an intermediate or a type 2 or maybe a type 3 sink tip. So anyway, there's lots of variables there. I don't want to confuse you too much, but I did want to take the time to explain why they come in different grain weights, why they come in different line weights, and why there are various sink rates in the fly lines.